YouTube listening friends. I am back again to share more of my deconstruction from Evangelical Christianity with you. Today's video, I want to share about the effects that I believe that the immersion or the indoctrination of Evangelical Christianity has had on my life. Again, I am 52 years old. My name is Kelly McGinnis. I am a life coach, and many of the things that I will share with you today that I see in my own life have been things that I have witnessed in numerous young women that I have coached on their own identity and self-awareness. So with that, let's begin. The very first thing that I want to talk about is fear. Fear is probably the number one thing, emotion, feeling, deep attachment that we have in our lives due to the effects of the deep indoctrination of Evangelical Christianity. Now, I am willing to admit that there are probably people who claim to be Christian who say, "Oh, I don't feel afraid because of it. I accepted Jesus and I know I'm fine," and they're just good with that. That's it. But for those of us who were raised under it, and again, I'll say in this video, as I did in my previous video, that I did not come up from a household where my parents were super indoctrinating of the faith, but because I was a young girl who had such a deep curiosity about God, I attached myself to the church where my parents took me and was always immersed in church somewhere. So it began with a journey of being a Southern Baptist and eventually into non-denominational churches, which experienced more of the charismatic side, which I believe is probably part of what led me out. So anyway, so for all Christians, perhaps they don't experience fear, but for those who have been, particularly in their developing young years, experienced parents or experienced any kind of indoctrination from within the church, and they attached to those beliefs and they believed and trusted in those beliefs, I think these effects you will find will be common threads that you have experienced as a person who has been deeply indoctrinated or deeply attached to some of those beliefs. I think the younger that it begins in your life, the more entrenched you are in the religion, the more that you will see these effects. So number one, as I said, is fear. So much fear. And I think for me, just as I mentioned in my first video about what led me out of Evangelical Christianity and how I began that deconstruction, I think I began to realize as I spent time alone that the visions I was having of God were visions of great love. I was extremely valuable to Him. And so in Christianity, there's almost this dichotomy of a face of a God who is love, who protects and who takes care of us and we feel safe with, versus a God whose face is one of judgment and anger and wrath, and a God who destroys humanity because of their sin. When they do things wrong, He destroys them. He tells other people to destroy them. That comes a lot from the Old Testament. I think if you look at the image of Jesus, you won't see that. But if you look at other places in the scriptures, any other places, honestly, because even Paul was, they talked about casting out people from within the local church because those people's sin could affect other people. And anyway, there was a lot of judgment within there. But so fear, you feel a lot of fear. Because you see these two faces of God and you know that you're a sinner and you know that you're wretched. And so a lot of that fear comes when you sin, even though the gospel teaches that Jesus covers your sin. You still know that what you have done is wrong and you still feel for that. And so you fear. So here's some areas of fear that I experienced. Number one was a fear of making decisions. I was so afraid that I would choose something that wasn't God's will because I was taught that I couldn't trust my own heart. And so I didn't know what God's will was. Like if I felt it and I desired it, then it was probably just me. That was probably not God's will because, I'm so selfish. God would never give me what I desire. I mean, I need to do, what He wants. I remember as a kid, even a young teenage girl, that I had a good friend and I was like, God, please don't let him be the one that I'm supposed to marry because I don't feel that way about him. And please don't let him be the one. And so just my natural mind thought that if I wanted it, it probably wasn't God's will. And if I didn't want it, it would probably end up being God's will. Scary place to live. But nonetheless, I didn't end up marrying that young man. even though he's a great man. I just didn't have that desire. So fear of making decisions is number one. I was always stifled. I would get into a place where I couldn't even move. I couldn't make a decision, even if it seemed good, even if it seemed like something's very simple. I wanted to hear from God so that I could know without a doubt that I was walking in God's will. And so that was one thing. Another thing is fear of hell. I mean, what kid doesn't fear hell, for Pete's sake? There are passages in the scriptures that say that you are a branch attached to the vine, and that for those branches that are not producing fruit, they can actually be cut off and burned. That's a little scary. Or what about the passage that says, I never knew you, depart from me? Those can be scary. And we're taught that there's a hell where people will burn forever in torment if they don't accept Jesus as their Savior, their blood atonement, saving grace. And so fear of hell can present a lot of fear for people. A third thing is the fear of the consequence of sin. So I grew up learning that if I obeyed, I was under an umbrella of protection. And if I disobeyed God, then that umbrella was not there for me. There was no promise of protection unless I was obedient. And so, we go through life, we're going to make mistakes, obviously, or we're going to choose things that we learn from that are not the right way to go. That's how we learn. But in a child's case and growing up, if you're not allowed that freedom and you have this fear that to mess up or to make a wrong decision means that you are no longer under the grace of God, or you are no longer under the safety of his umbrella, because you're going to suffer the consequences, right? We reap what we sow. And so if you sowed that, well, by golly, I guess you ought to reap what you're reaping now. You deserve that. And so anyway, there was that fear that I would lose that protection or be cut off. There was also a fear of demons, and being misled. I used to literally fear even reading any other material. Or for a while, my daughter had a little frog in her room that was meditating and had its fingers like this. And I feared that demons were attached to that demons were somehow going to influence our home and our family because of this little emblem that was in our house. That was fear. Fear of the evil world around us. People were evil. They were not like us. And so there was just a fear of the world of evil and what kind of evil lurked. And you couldn't see demons, but they were very real. And there was even teachings that those spirits, and I've heard the same thing, people since I have left the faith have even accused me of that being, having demonic spirits, lying spirits on me that could affect others just by my being in their presence. Well, that can present a little bit of fear. If you think you have no control and you have no protection over yourself, that spirits can jump from that person to another person, that presents a lot of fear. So even that kind of fear. And then as an adult, once I became an adult and I started having children, and I was reading books that were teaching me that I was responsible for the souls of my children until they accepted Jesus. I was the Holy Spirit that would be their guide. I felt a big responsibility. That was a little bit fearful, but beyond that, as they started growing and making decisions on their own apart from me, I couldn't control their decision, and it scared the living daylights out of me that my children were going to be out of the protective bubble of God because they chose something different. So now the fear has moved from just beyond my own choices and my own behavior into my 4 children. Like, okay, what decisions are they going to make that's going to bring disaster in their life? And I feared that. And what happens when we fear? We pull in and bring in a lot of control, which is what my older 3 children experience. So just a lot of fear about our whole life, making decisions, everything, just a lot of fear. Secondly is separation. So this is another effect of Christianity in my life. There was separation from other people, separation from myself, and even ultimately separation from God. And I'll explain each of those. So separation from others, in general, just separation from my normal peers in the world, separation from my neighbors. There was always us and them, the sheep and the goats. There was always we had the truth, we had the way, and everybody else, no matter what they believed, no matter if they seemed spiritual, it didn't matter because that was a different God and it was a false God, and we alone had the truth and we alone were saved. And unless they came our way, they were going to hell one day. And so there was a huge separation. I always felt like I wasn't like other people. even growing up, even as a kid, that I didn't have anything in common. And we were taught to not be unequally yoked with people in the outside world. I know of young women today that are married to men who are not, I wouldn't say they don't believe in God or anything, but the woman is a strong, indoctrinated Christian, and her husband, would say he's a Christian, but he doesn't go to church. He doesn't read his Bible every day. He's not doing the things that a good Christian would do. And so the girls will struggle with that. It's like there's this disunity, this separation. Don't be unequally yoked. And it becomes a real problem within a marriage because people who have that feel this unequally yoked feeling. Anyway, it is a separation. It brings separation just simply because I have the truth, you don't. I have the Spirit of God, you don't. And that just brings division. It stinks. It brings a lot of division rather than unity to humanity. There was separation also from others, not just those in the world, but even within the church. I think there are signs of separation. Now, I know Christians would totally disagree with this, but there is definitely a hierarchy that occurs within the Christian evangelical church. Now, they would just call this submission to parents, submission to your husband, submission to the leadership and elders of the church. It's just submission for your own safety. But the truth is, it's a hierarchy, and those who perform well and do all the right things are higher in the ranking of the church. And so, to be honest with you, my identity was wrapped up a lot in my belief system and in my being a Christian within the church, because to be honest, I would sometimes succeed at this because I was so steeped in it that I would do well. I was always there. I was going to be there on a Sunday. I was going to be there for any activities the church held. I volunteered tons of time, tons of money. We were tithers. We tithed every single paycheck. We were reliable Christians within any church that we attended. So we might have been considered a little higher up on the hierarchy because we were so committed and we knew the theology. Buddy, did we know the theology? And we could spew it. We could teach it in Sunday school to children, to any age. So we were in that hierarchy. But even though we loved and accepted people who came in, there was clearly a distinction between those that were truly hot and those who were lukewarm. And if you're a Christian, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There were those who were just dedicated, and whether they ate or they drank or whatsoever things they did unto the glory of the Lord. And they had their quiet times, they prayed for others, they led, hierarchy. And so in some ways it brings a separation from genuineness among your people, because people recognize that. People know there's that division. People know that these are considered better. I mean, if there was a time, I know the church has gotten better about this, but there was a time when if you had a divorce in your life, you could not even serve in certain positions because that was a big no-no. But now I think the church has gotten a lot better about that particular one. But for Pete's sake, in most churches today, you certainly cannot be gay. You cannot be a lesbian. You cannot do any of that, or you will, we might allow you to come be with us in church, but you're certainly not going to hold any form of leadership about leading people to God, because that's a no-no. Homosexuality is a no-no, and we don't, the Bible says it's a no-no, so we don't do it. So it actually brings separation even within the community of the church. Because honestly, people, when you view someone else as higher up than you or better than you in the category of Christianity, and you have stuff in your heart, you're not going to allow that stuff to be seen. Why would you dare do that? Or for those who do, they're the ones who just feel helpless and, will you please help me to be more like you? It's just that stupidity. There's not a common equal ground. So not only are we separated from people outside of the church walls, but there's also a separation from people who are within the church walls. And a third way of separation that we see as evidence and effect of Christianity in our lives is we separate from ourselves. We separate from ourselves. We don't even know, for those of us who've been deeply indoctrinated and entrenched in this theology, we don't even know our true selves. We are not in touch with our true selves. Why? because we're taught that we're wretched like our whole lives. We worship Jesus because he saved us from our own wretchedness. The focus is all about him. And you will hear that repeatedly. It is all about him. It is all about him. Nothing is about me. We lay down our lives. We lay down our lives. We take up our cross, man. We're going to suffer and follow him. It's not about me. It's never about me. As a matter of fact, if I ever make it about me, that is the ultimate of pride. And when we have pride and not humility, that is the worst. So you're always on guard against yourself rising up. You're always on guard against anything that you feel, because usually what you feel or what you want, it's considered selfish. So what you do is you suppress your own identity. You suppress the things that you love. You lose track of who you really are and who you were made to be. So I think there's a separation from others, but there's also even a separation of ourselves. And when we come out of this indoctrination, I think one of the first things that I began to realize was the value of who I was, the uniqueness of who I was, that I was valuable, I was loved, my thoughts mattered, my feelings mattered. And I am not one to keep things closed up, but I definitely had thoughts about, you need to suppress that. That's just purely selfish. That's pride. Do you think if I teach or I stand up, if I want to be in front of people and be a teacher, that's probably prideful. I probably shouldn't even want to do that because that's wrong. No, that's who I am. I talk. I love to talk. I love to share deep things. I love to share the things of my heart, the things that I'm learning, like in this video today. And so, but used to, I would try to suppress that because it seemed like such an evil, selfish, prideful type thing. So separation from others, separation from self, and even finally, it brings about a separation from God. Now, I will tell you in this point in the video that I'm not even sure what I believe about God. As I began to change and I began to experience new things, even in my prayer journaling times, one thing that came about was I felt like I was hearing that I was one with God. There was a oneness, and I've read all kinds of different verbiage on that, different interpretations of that exact same thing using different words. Just the oneness of the universe, the oneness of humanity, which I think actually fits my Christian doctrine pretty well. But because we learn that God is almost a fearful God, and we are taught the beginning of wisdom, a scripture verse, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, I'm going to tell you, it is taught that fear in that verse simply means reverence for God, having reverence for God. But when you are taught that a God who loves also destroys, a God who protects you also brings judgment to the things, to sin, then you have a dichotomy face of God, and you don't know which one to trust. If you think about a child who is in an abusive family, and one day mom is loving and hugging and holding and protecting, and then the next moment the child turns around and the mother is screaming and throwing things, that child does not learn to trust. That child does not lean towards the side of love. That child is damaged because there is no trust. There is no ability to trust. We can see that clearly in humanity. But the Christian will tell you that it's okay for God to be that way because he's God. Anyway, separation from God. When you have a fear like that, you tend to want to hide, particularly, even like in the story of Adam and Eve, particularly if you feel like you might have done something wrong. But you lose sight of what is right and wrong because you have so many standards that you can take anything and turn it into wrong. If it didn't look like love, it's sinful, it's selfish, it's prideful, and you are the describer of what love looks like and when and how it needs to be displayed. So it doesn't take very much sin to bring about this guilt and shame and fear of God as a result, because you view God in a certain way. So a lot of people, even in some of my coaching, I've experienced leading girls into times where they close their eyes and relax, and they come into the presence of Jesus or God, whatever that figure looks like to them. And many of them will actually experience not being able to come close to him, or not feeling very unworthy to be in his presence, very unworthy to come near to him, very unworthy of him speaking to them. So this is not just me. This is a very common thread that happens, even though we, quote, know we've been forgiven. you still have this face of God that does not fade away within your mind. So separation. So fear is an effect of this indoctrination, separation from others, from true self-identity, and separation even from this God divine figure in our lives is created. So another thing, a third thing, is judgment, or being very judgmental. And how does this show up? Well, it shows up as we judge other people, particularly. We are continuously judging others by this standard that we have. And I'm going to tell you that standard Christians will tell you we don't live by the law anymore. That's what they will say, but we do. We live by very strong standards. And you don't drink, or if you do, you only have one. You certainly don't ever get drunk. You don't have sex out of wedlock. You would never spend the night with a male, because that even has the appearance of evil, and you don't even want to go close to what looks like evil. You don't watch certain movies because they have terrible language in them. And so these are the standards that we put on ourselves, even quiet times. I need to have a quiet time. How long does that quiet time need to be, etc., etc.? And so not only does the standard come upon ourselves, but we place that standard upon others, and we measure them up according to the standard that we think is right, godly, good, holy, because what we're striving to be holy as He is holy. And so we become very judgmental of other people and harsh on other people. Talk about creating some separation. Judging other people will definitely bring some separation there. But not only do we judge other people, but we judge ourselves. Holy cow. This is what continues to put us in this cycle, which is another effect that I'm counting as number 4. Puts us in a continuous cycle of guilt and shame. Why? Because we are judging ourselves, and once again, we don't measure up to the standard. We're striving to be holy as God is holy. And even though I know I'm forgiven, I want to be pleasing in all that I do. And once again, I've failed. And so there's this constant cycle of guilt and shame versus the opposite of that, which is like a self-righteousness. So I'm doing great. I feel good. I'm elated. So we have these bouts of going back and forth in self-righteousness. So self-righteousness can also be an effect. If we're doing well, which I typically, honestly, I did well a lot. And I had a lot of self-righteousness. And that self-righteousness would make me look at other people and go, what the hell? Why don't you pull up your bootstraps there and do what you need to do? Because if I can do it, dang it, you can do it, Very judgmental of other people. So we can pretend to have a face of love, but deep down on the inside, there's this standard that we are measuring people by. It's like I said, a person can come into your church and they can have certain habits or certain behaviors or come from a certain background, and the church will accept and love them. I mean, obviously, those are the people we want to help, and we want to make them become more like us because we know the truth, and we have grown in the truth, and we have grown in our ability of self-control and to live the life that is pleasing to God. And so we can help you to do the same thing, right? So, judgment of others, but judgment of self. And when we judge ourselves, we either feel that we are performing well, okay? We're living in this performance way, that we are performing well, and so we are elated and self-righteous and feeling great about ourselves, better than others, better than whatever, self-righteous. Or we live in this defeated mode of always feeling guilt and shame because we feel like we can't measure up, and we can't keep the standard, and we can't live it out all the time. I got mad at my husband. Dang it, I yelled at him. I cussed at him. And so then we live in guilt and shame because we did it again. Darn it, I repeated it again. I did it again. And so we just live in this crushed place of guilt and shame, which will absolutely destroy us. So again, number 3 was judgment, but number 4 is the guilt and shame is an effect. Number 5 is self-righteousness can be an effect. And number 6, I'm going to go into as perfectionism. Because we're taught God is holy, and therefore we should strive to be holy. And we're always moving from glory to glory, more into the likeness of Jesus, right? We want to be more like Jesus. And so that's our goal. That's what we're constantly striving for, is this perfectionism in all that we do. And so we won't even allow ourselves to experience certain emotions. We stuff those things down because we are striving for perfectionism. And we have been taught that sometimes your thoughts are going to come in, but those are just thoughts from the devil. Don't listen to the thoughts from the devil. You know what? They're really subconscious thoughts that are rising up within you, and you keep pressing them down. It's just going to get worse. But anyway, we're striving to be like Jesus. We're striving to be holy. I mean, can I tell you how hard I would strive in my life? I was determined I was going to get there. So perfectionism begins to rule every part of our life. Like, we can't stand for anything to not be perfect or right. And so maybe it's certain categories, but perfectionism can begin to rule. And when you're putting perfectionism, the stamp of being like God, being like Jesus on yourself all the time, you're going to go right back into the bouts of guilt and shame and self-righteousness. So perfectionism is a, 6, 7? I forgot what number I'm on. Okay. Another characteristic that will come into your life if you live under this strong indoctrination and you attach to all these beliefs is confusion. You will live in a state of confusion because honestly, you're trying to figure everything out and you're trying to live this holy and pure life. So for me, I always felt like I said, we couldn't trust our heart. And so because I couldn't trust my heart, I needed to hear from God to know what to do. I needed to know, was that job what I was supposed to do? Was that Bible study what I'm supposed to lead? Am I supposed to take that Sunday school class? Am I supposed to be friends with this person? Is this the person I'm supposed to marry? I needed to hear from God. And 9 times out of 10, I did not feel confident in what I was experiencing. This voice, this answer, this thing I was looking for, I couldn't tell, was that me or was that God? And so it left me in a state of confusion all the time. And so it would paralyze me. It was another fear, because if I lived in this place of confusion, of not knowing for sure what I was supposed to do, then there was a possibility I could be disobeying God. Okay. And that was something that was just out of the question. I did not want to do. And so it brought a ton of confusion into my life. I knew the doctrine, I knew the theology, so I wasn't confused by the theology, but I was greatly confused in decisions that I needed to make in life. I think others could probably be confused in other ways. Like, a lot of people are confused because I know that my daughter, one of my daughters, struggled with the way that she perceived God inwardly. She just saw him so much as an unconditionally loving God, and that's what she would experience. But then she would hear something so contrary to that, and it would bring confusion. She would often feel like the black sheep in the family because we would just spit the theology right back out at her about, well, this is the truth and this is how it works. And I know it doesn't always make sense, but this is what it is. And so that can bring confusion into a person's life, particularly children. I can only imagine how confused they can be. But the truth is, children are actually very accepting because we trust the adults in our lives, the people that are teaching us truth. We're actually very accepting of the things that they teach us. But confusion, that's another one. Number 8, I think we are on, is limitations. Limitations, just limiting ourselves in so many ways. I mean, personally, in this day in my life, I believe that Jesus came. I believe he was a human. I believe he was, like I said, I don't even know for sure exactly what I believe about God. I do believe there's something greater outside of ourselves, something bigger, something more than just this life. I mean, even the near-death experiences that I hear about display this grander love and peace and joy and perfection. And so I do believe that exists. I don't know that it's a he. I certainly do not see it outside of myself anymore. It is the fabric of everything that exists. It runs through us deep within. No one lacks it. It isn't given to some and not to others. I don't believe that. And so when we immerse ourselves in this Christian doctrine, we limit ourselves in so many ways. One of the ways I know for me was I loved talking, teaching. I loved speaking. That was something that was just from the time I was a little girl, I was doing it. I mean, honestly, like I said in my first video, I would bring my neighbors over to teach them and talk to them about God. And so, but in the Christian faith, even though we've come a long way, used to in New Testament days when they had writings, women covered their heads and never spoke in church. At least to this day, the church, in most churches, this is not true of all, but in most evangelical Christian churches, we have moved beyond that to a point that women can speak. They can even speak on the stage. They can't be preachers, and they certainly can't be elders. So there are limitations to that. Women are below men. I don't know what they do with the verse that says there is no Jew nor Gentile, no male nor female. Like there is no separation. There should not be this hierarchy. There isn't. Because why? Because we know how to love each other. We know how to get along whether we're male or female. There doesn't have to be this hierarchy that someone submits to when love is present and everyone considers one another. You don't have to have that. So, anyway, so the limitation as a woman for me in the church, I knew that I could not be a preacher ever. I could not be that, even if I desired that. That was certainly not God's will. I knew that one cut and dry because the church told me that women can't be preachers, and that's the word, and I believe that, and I saw that within the text of the Bible. So yeah, limiting myself in that way. I also limited myself in other ways because like I said earlier, if it was something I desired, I didn't necessarily trust that that was from God. And so I would limit myself on things like that. That must not be the will of God, or well, it wouldn't be the will of God for that. So even though I desire that, I'm not going to do that because that's not God's will. Very limiting. Also, I limited myself when I went into my adulthood years. I got married when I was 20 and started having my children when I was 24. And there's nothing wrong with being a stay-at-home mom. And honestly, I look at my life and I really would not change the fact that I had the privilege to be a stay-at-home mom and to take care of my children's needs. You know, like if they're sick or whatever, I didn't have a job I had to go to. I could take care of my kids when I needed to. So anyway, but the belief that my role was just to focus on that. My role was to be a wife and to be a mom. My role was to take care of my family. I was to be the Proverbs 31 woman. Heck, who the hell can be a Proverbs 31 woman is what I'm saying. Like, there's too much there. That's impossible. When I started looking at that more closely, I was like, no one can do all that. That's impossible. But anyway, yes, so I limited myself in the fact that I would not allow myself to do certain things because I had to fulfill these certain roles first. Now, once my children grew up and they were older, I was able to begin, finishing out my studies and doing other things. But if it was a God thing where I volunteered in the church, it was okay. But anything else, not so much so. A ninth thing is lack of self-confidence and self-worth. And I think this is one that doesn't really even need to be mentioned. You are continuously suppressing who you really are. You are continually believing that what you are supposed to be, you are not. You are wretched. You are broken. So you're constantly thinking about how broken you are. And you're praising somebody else for just being able to cover you up, for Pete's sake. Just cover me. I'm so wretched. Cover all this sin and wretchedness. I mean, like, my heart is disgusting and broken. Like, thank you, Jesus, that you've given your life for me. I don't mean to make joke of that, because I know if anybody watches this video and they still have some sort of attachment to this Jesus figure that brought salvation, I don't even know what I believe about Jesus. There's not very much historical evidence about Jesus. But even if I had believed in the passages of the Bible that portray Jesus' life on earth, I still would not come to the same conclusions, because Jesus did not teach the same thing. And he taught he was one with God. He taught that he was the Son of the Father. I believe that we are one with God. And I believe that we are the children of God too. So I really believe that he came to show us the way. He came to show us the way to life. He came to show us that there's this kingdom mindset of the world or whatever that we live in, but that there is a kingdom, a different kingdom of God, of who your true identity is, who you really are, that you don't even see. Jesus said he had compassion on people because they were like lost and wandering. They had lost their true shepherd. It's like they were following this religious people and this indoctrination, and they were feeling wretched. And they were lost, and they were not living up to what I would say is the glory of God. To sin is to miss the mark of being the glory of God that you were made to be. And so I feel like our self-confidence and self-worth through the indoctrination of this theology just teaches us the very opposite. Instead of teaching us that we are made in the image of God, valuable and capable of even living a life like Jesus, we are taught the very opposite, that we are sinners, we are broken, we are wretched. And so we are constantly looking for that. When I started journaling with God, I would go into that quiet time and I would say to him, God, just show me all the things that I need to change. show me the things that are wrong in me. And he would just smile and rub my head, and he would just tell me, I am not here to point out anything wrong in you. And then he would remind me, I would see myself as a child a lot of times, but many times I would see myself as this adult princess that he would dance with. And we would just dance and delight, and it was fun and joyful. And he didn't perceive me in this negative way that I had been taught to perceive myself. He perceived me with an abundance of love and admiration and just joy, pure joy and delight. And so I started learning through this vision process that I am valuable and that I am not wretched. And so I really, honestly, today it's hard for me to even sit in a church service to hear the songs. I can't listen to Christian music anymore because the songs are just about how wretched we are and how thank you for the blood, because the blood is what covers us and allows us to be seen by God. God sees us. If there is whatever this God, divine source is, it is one with us. It recognizes and knows us. It does not view us the same way we view ourselves. So anyway, number 9 that I just really went haywire on is lack of self-confidence and self-worth. It is a freaking lie to think that we are not valuable or that we have all this brokenness. Our hearts are not deceitful. There's actually this very deep place within us that can be in our inner self, in our soul, that is a great guide and a great source of wisdom. I believe it's that energy source of God that is within us. We are not broken sinners in the hands of an angry God. That is not who we are. So anyway, just sharing that. Also, a 10th thing is the suppression of emotion, which I think I've already mentioned to you guys, that we will suppress our emotions. If we feel anger, we will want to suppress that because we don't want to feel anger, and we certainly don't want to act out on that anger. If we feel a sexual drive and we're taught that this is impure and this is unholy, then we will suppress things like that. I used to have a friend that when her children would come to play, they would have such a good time with my girls. But when it was time to go home and she said, let's go, sometimes they would start to cry because they didn't want to go. And she would often take them to the bathroom and scold them for their tears and teach them that you obey and you come when I tell you that it's time to come. We don't do this. We don't play this game of crying. All they were doing was feeling emotion because they'd had a great time with a friend. They were little. They were young kids. 5, 6 years old. So we're taught to suppress those emotions in order to be pure because those emotions that we feel are wrong. And no, that's not true. We need to feel those emotions. Okay, so number 11 is the complication of life. Like everything becomes so complicated. And for me, I became so serious. Everything was serious. Well, it freaking is serious when you have this indoctrination that you are broken, but you are supposed to be holy as God is holy. Your neighbors who don't even know this truth are going to hell, and their blood is on your hands. That is heavy stuff. So, of course, I became a serious person. I took it very serious. I took it to heart. I took it as truth. Like the truth, the absolute truth. That's what I was taught. It was God's word that said this. And so I was a Christian who was digging deeper. I didn't go just to the surface level, man. I dug deep. And those were the things that I carried. And so life became extremely complicated instead of just simple. I couldn't trust my heart. So there was complication to even know what decisions I needed to make because life just became so complicated. And a final thing that I want to mention today in this video is harsh parenting will come from that. And I put this one last because all of these other things that I've listed, like those were things within myself that I was experiencing. And then when I started raising my 3 daughters, now my son, my 4th one, came along later in life. And so he's actually had different parents in a sense. But my girls grew up under harsh parenting. And I'm not telling you that I don't want you, when I say harsh parenting, I don't want to give the image that I was just always screaming at them and spanking them and whipping them into submission. Or I looked like your commonplace, one of the higher level Christians, one of the more dedicated Christians. They were always reading the Bible to their children. They were always teaching them memorization of scripture. I used to have an if-then chart that I had gotten from doorposts that said, if you do this behavior, then this is the consequence. And attached to that was a Bible verse of why this is wrong. Why you're being selfish, why you should submit to your authorities and obey and you're not, or why. And so it was all attached to God, every bit of it, all the discipline. And so remember, I also had that fear that my children were going to veer away from the things of God. They were going to allow themselves to do things that weren't right. And so if they did, they were no longer safe and under the umbrella of God's safety. And so fear and responsibility of their lives caused me to really, I would say, press in kind of hard with indoctrination and truth, because I wanted them to be saved and I wanted them to have a heart that obeyed and followed God. And that meant they were doing the right thing, and they weren't. So we didn't have TV. We didn't watch. If we did have TV, they watched videos, but they were very limited on what they could watch. And there were things I was really afraid of them diving into or touching because it had an appearance of evil. And if it had an appearance of evil, we stayed away from it. And so there were a lot of things that they desired that I held back and would not allow because I feared what might come into their lives and our family's life if they veered away. And so I took that very seriously. So the harsh parenting and the damage, honestly, all these things that I've listed, I think my children have had to work through a lot of them because they were indoctrinated through me. I'm very thankful that to this day, I live close to two of my oldest two daughters, and my youngest one is lives in Hawaii, and so I haven't had quite the reconnection with her that I have had with the older two. But the older two, there's been a lot of healing because we've been able to talk about these things, and I've asked for forgiveness, and we've been able to address it. And so there's been healing, and there can be healing in all of these things. So if you are one of the people that were like me and you've experienced that attachment to evangelical Christianity and all of its theology and teachings, and you've experienced some of these things in your life, I just want to tell you that you are not alone, and that this does not mean you stay this way forever. And this does not mean that even that time of your life was in vain. Like, we can go forward knowing who we really are, knowing our true identity and our value and our worth. And we don't have to live in fear. We can actually live in love, knowing that we are loved, knowing that we are safe. And so fear doesn't even have to consume us anymore. But a lot of those things become subconscious patterns, and there is some work that we have to do to overcome those things. But I just want to give you the hope that you don't have to remain there, and this does not have to control your life forevermore. So again, if you would like to talk with me, I would be more than happy. I have a website at kellymcginnis.com, and I'll put that in the description below. So anyway, best wishes to you. Thank you for listening to this video.